Hello and welcome to the Scholar Circle, scholarcircle.org. I'm Maria Armoudian. In this hour, what does Russia's attack on Ukraine mean for the region and the world? Doug Becker explores.
I'm Doug Becker. A land war has returned to Europe. This week, Russia attacked Ukraine. On this week's show, we will explore the causes of the conflict, motivation of the actors, how diplomacy failed, and ask whether or not this war could have been avoided. We will also explore international responses as well as domestic responses within Russia that could lead to a return of peace. Our panel today is Anna Ohanyan, the Richard B. Finnegan Distinguished Professor of Political Science and International Relations at Stonehill College. She's the editor of Russia Abroad, Driving Regional Fracture in Post-Communist Eurasia and Beyond, and her latest book is The Neighborhood Effect, The Imperial Roots of Regional Fracture in Post-Communist Eurasia. Robert English, Associate Professor of International Relations and co-director of the Central European Studies program at the University of Southern California. He's the author of Russia and the Idea of the West. And Serhiy Kudelia, Associate Professor of Political Science at Baylor University. He's the author of When Numbers Are Not Enough, The Strategic Use of Violence in Ukraine's 2014 Revolution. And a note, I have also published a piece on this topic. The title is The Rationality and Emotion of Russian Historical Memory, The Case of Crimea. And you can find this in Crisis and Change in Post-Cold War Global Politics, Ukraine in a Comparative Perspective. A note on today's show, since events are ongoing, we recorded on February the 25th. Thank you all for joining us. This is clearly a difficult time, but an extremely important conversation that I suspect we've all been having professionally and personally. And so, Serhiy Kudelia, one of the most common questions I get, just how bad is this? So I'll pay that forward and ask you, just how bad is this conflict?
Thank you, Douglas. So as a Ukrainian, of course, I will answer that I've never felt worse in my life. It is terrible. It is awful what's happening in Ukraine. It is my own country where I was born. I was raised. I received education. And the country to which I'm very strongly attached, country where I still have my relatives, members of my family, and a lot of friends. But I should say that apart from my personal attachment to my own country and my personal connection to this country, I think it's terrible for Europe. I think it's terrible for the entire world. Let me give you just an example of the scale of the conflict that is unfolding right now in front of our eyes. We are looking at the conflict between a country, on one hand, that started the war, that launched the invasion, the country that has 120 million people in it, one of the most populous countries in the world and the largest in size, that is now attacking a country that has 45 million people, and that is the second largest country in Europe by size. Now imagine the scale of the conflict that this clash, that this military confrontation can take in the future, and the spillover effects that this conflict will have for the entire Europe. Moreover, I think it's also terrible, not just because we are dealing with such a large-scale conflict, but also because we are likely to see an outcome that will be permanently inscribed in the new Ukraine, in the future Ukrainian territory, the outcome that is likely to produce a partition of an independent state, an outcome that will put in danger, in permanent danger, other parts of Europe. Because the precedent that Putin sets, the precedent of an attack on a sovereign country that was seeking an alliance with the Western world, that was seeking an alliance with Europe, exercising its own sovereign right to join any organization it wants. And we see that a leader, one of the largest countries in the world, decided that he has power to stop this country from exercising its sovereign right. Because if we listen to Putin's speech, we hear explicitly stated concern with the fact that Ukraine may want in the future, in the long-term future, not tomorrow, not next week or next year, but in the long-term future, may want to join NATO. And he believes that he has it in his power to veto the decision of this country, and not only veto, but also punish the people of this country by destroying their land, by destroying their country. Once that precedent is set, and once he actually succeeds in achieving this outcome, and we can discuss whether it's likely or not, but if he does destroy the country and divides it into multiple different units, it is absolutely certain that from that moment on, Russia will pose a deadly threat to other countries in Europe and to other parts of the Western world. And no other country would be able to feel safe. We can never talk about security in Europe in the same terms again.
And Rob English, one of the enduring questions, how much is Russia's aggression towards Ukraine kind of consistent with the Russian foreign policy with the former republics in the USSR, or is this a fairly unique case that has much more to do with the historical relationship between Russia and Ukraine?
This attack on Ukraine is so monstrous, so massive, so aberrant that it's not consistent with anything. If what you're really asking is it simply a difference of degree, not kind? Has Russia been slowly or gradually aiming, I don't know, to reassemble the old Soviet Union, or to simply exert hegemony in its backyard, create buffer states, sphere of influence? You can find some consistency there, but again, it's so monstrously orders of magnitude bigger that, for example, to compare it with, let's not forget, let me just digress to make this clear, that if you're alluding to other post-Soviet conflicts, frozen conflicts, places where Russia still has troops, for example, then some of them go back to Gorbachev's time. Not even Boris Yeltsin, but before. So Putin was hardly the one who created them. Let's say, for example, in Moldova, where I spent quite a bit of time exactly then in 89, 90, when as the Soviet Union was moving towards breakup, and as various republics were expressing, demanding, claiming sovereignty, in Moldova, where the majority population is Romanian, there was a political current that wanted to actually unify with Romania. And this was terrifying to the Slavic population in the east, on the left bank of the Dniester River, not just Russians, but by the way, Ukrainians, who were solidly against being dragged into a union with Romania, still under Ceausescu, and also more broadly, moving from the Slavic alphabet to the Latin alphabet, making the Romanian or Moldovan language, right? So it was the usual kind of matryoshka nationalism. One republic moves towards secession, the smaller minorities within it, in turn, do likewise. And that all happened under Gorbachev. That began then. And Russian troops, Soviet-era troops, were already there. It was part of the Soviet Union, and they haven't gone home, and now they're Russian troops. So is this now in Ukraine an extension of that? Was that the beginning? Because under Yeltsin then, when Gorbachev shortly after fell from power, the Soviet Union collapsed, but Yeltsin continued to support in one way or the other, and in other republics as well. I don't need to tell you the story of Georgia and the breakaway regions in Abkhazia and South Ossetia. Anna can speak about Armenia and Karabakh, of course. I still think overall, Doug, I see where you're headed with this, and Russia was already exerting influence sometimes justifying it by protecting Russians abroad, sometimes just to keep order where they didn't start the conflict, but it affected them. This is different. This builds on that in some way, but it's like a leap to something so much huger under Putin that I guess I'm going to come down mostly on the side of no, although perhaps some foundations or precedents were laid. But I'm back with almost everyone here who saw, as we were speaking in our introduction, Anna said correctly, even those of us who didn't admire Putin, who saw so much bad in Putin, but always also saw someone who was calculating, careful, acted in what he thought was Russia's interests, and never gambled. I mean, his gambles were small. They always paid off. He risked little to gain a lot. Now he's risking everything. And as I've said, and I'll stop with this, my prediction when people asked me a week ago, would this happen? I said, no, probably not. I didn't know, but I said, probably not, because if he tries to swallow all of Ukraine, he will choke to death. And we're seeing some gagging sounds already, right? I'm still confident that the choke to death part of my prediction will be proved accurate, not in a week or a month, but maybe within 6 months or a year. And we can talk about domestic Russian opposition and so much else.
I definitely want to get into the impact this is having within Russia. But Anna Ohanyan, right now, what I really would like to get into is what kind of impact this is having, certainly the impact on Ukraine, but in the entire region. I think I would agree with what Rob just said, that this seems like an escalation that's fairly unprecedented, certainly, post 1991, unprecedented. A, is it unprecedented? And B, what does this mean for regional security?
Sure. I think this is unprecedented in several respects. If we had this conversation before his February 21 speech, maybe after he recognized the independence without starting the launch on full-scale war of conquest, pretty much, I probably would say this still falls within Putin's signature of using de facto states, even though the internal politics in the two republics is somewhat different than what you have in Abkhazia and Ossetia and what you have in Nagorno-Karabakh. But still, if he's going to use these de facto territories to project global power, to kind of make sure that Ukraine does not move to the West, etc. So that still would be in tune with what Kremlin has been doing so far. But with this full-on scale war on Ukraine, number one, as Serhiy mentioned, this is a really assault on international rules-based world order. The norm of territorial integrity is perhaps the strongest one out there that is really shattered with this. This is also relevant for the war in Nagorno-Karabakh in 2020, that this is bulldozing through an existing peace process, no matter how flawed. So negotiated peace settlements is a significant public good that has emerged in the post-Soviet period. You had a conflict spike, but also negotiated agreements. This is also an assault on that. So it's very dangerous for the world. But I would like to add that I read his speech combined with this attack on Ukraine as a unabashedly imperial. I have been one of those researchers who always thought that Russia can be viewed, should be viewed as an actor that provides security in its neighborhoods, no matter how flawed, that it is able to stop the bloodshed, let's say Nagorno-Karabakh, but cannot do a lot of peace building. So I kind of was thinking that considering that US is pulling out of the world, we have to learn to live with illiberal powers trying to do conflict management. But what is happening with this war, and with his speech in particular, not only he questioned the identity, legality, the list can go on of Ukraine, but he also seemed to rewind Russia's political history to the Soviet collapse and saying that we're going to have our imperial moment. I looked at this speech and I thought, oh my gosh, we always thought that the collapse of the Soviet Union was more or less peaceful if you don't count the small wars. But what he's forcing here on the region, Algerian war of decolonization, and we're still yet to produce a Gandhi. I'm playing fast and loose with historical analogies, But I think he's forcing an imperial moment. He wants us to look at this region as an imperial collapse, and that he's against international law. We have had several empires collapse in the 20th century, and all of the state system that has emerged out of the imperial collapse. So he's one of the only leader that I know that basically saying that is not fair, that Russian Empire is entitled to all these territories that it lost, no matter the historical, where the borders go. So I feel very shocked by that speech and by subsequently what he did. I did not think that Russia, the Kremlin, would engage in this war. It is against the interests of the Russian people for decades to come. It really put Russia out of the competition of the multipolarity within the Eurasian continent.
And you're listening to Scholar Circle, scholarcircle.org. We're discussing the ongoing war between Russia and Ukraine with Anna Ohanyan of Stonehill College, Robert English of the University of Southern California, and Serhiy Kudelia of Baylor University. And Serhiy, Anna just used a phrase that I think is really pretty enlightening here, the idea of bulldozing a peace process, because I know there's been quite a bit of conversation, quite a bit of discourse about whether or not there was a diplomatic resolution to this crisis prior to the attack. I guess the first question, was there a diplomatic resolution, or is the nature of this war kind of disproving the idea that this was a diplomatic crisis gone awry, and instead there was a bit more intentionality on the part of Russia and aggression, and that maybe the diplomacy was a bit of a fig leaf?
Well, the diplomatic solution was there. It came in the form of the Minsk agreements. First, the Minsk agreement was signed in September 2014. The second Minsk agreement was signed in February 2015. Now, there is one problem, major problem with the Minsk agreements. You may ask, how were these Minsk agreements signed? And of course, the Minsk agreements were not signed as a result of equal bargaining of equal parties at the negotiation table. After weeks and weeks of spending their time, maybe in Switzerland behind closed doors or in other neutral country, they were signed under the pressure, coercive pressure of Russia that was intervening in Ukraine, both in August, September of 2014 and in February 2015, directly through the use of their regular troops, and that were backing a separatist advance on other parts of eastern Ukraine, specifically the region of Donbass. And as a result of that imbalance that existed on the battlefield at that time in 14 and 15, the Minsk agreement was designed in a way that strongly favored Russia. And we understand that any types of diplomatic settlements, they reflect the asymmetry of the relationship between the powers that are signing these agreements. So there is nothing unusual about this. But again, let me emphasize, it's one thing to sign these agreements as a result of quiet negotiations for a long time between diplomats who reason and argue about different provisions. It's quite different when you sign it quickly in order to prevent a further capture of the Ukrainian territory. And that is what was at stake both in 14 and 15 for President Poroshenko, who was involved in signing these agreements directly and negotiating them with Vladimir Putin. And so for this very reason, that they were signed following these defeats of the Ukrainian army, the Ukrainian society did not view these agreements as legitimate. The Ukrainian political elites did not view these agreements as legitimate by and large, not all of them, of course, and Ukraine is a pluralistic society, and we have multiple different viewpoints that are expressed in the parliament and in media. But many of the opinion polls that have been conducted since then showed that Minsk agreements were extremely unpopular in the Ukrainian society, and that the compromises that Ukraine had to make in order to fulfill Minsk agreements were viewed as unacceptable by the majority of the Ukrainian public. And because of this dominant view within the society and among political elites, Minsk agreements very quickly became stalled. Their implementation was stalled on the level of the government, on the level of the ministers, on the level of bureaucracies. They were arguing, of course, about the minuscule things, who will do what first. These technical issues may be important, but they're not crucial for understanding why the Minsk agreements were not implemented. The fundamental reason why they were never implemented was Ukraine did not believe in the legitimacy and did not accept the legitimacy of these agreements. The essence of the Minsk agreements, though, certainly contained in it a certain type of common solution that many countries that go through the type of conflict that we experienced in Eastern Ukraine do. And let me just very quickly say that there is a lot of contention on how you classify that conflict in 2014 and 15. Russia, of course, is claiming that it was a civil war, and it is a civil war. On the other hand, the Ukrainians are saying that it's purely a Russian concocted conflict. My personal opinion, and I studied this conflict closely, is that it represents a hybrid option of an internationalized internal conflict that has both a civil component to it and an international component to it, because there were genuine citizens of Ukraine in these regions who disagreed with the Ukrainian authorities and were willing to separate Donbass from that region. They were genuinely opposed to remaining within Ukrainian state and volunteered to join these separatist militias. But there is also a recognition that without Russian support and help, that type of insurgency would never hold. It would never really succeeded in spreading to the extent that it did. And so for that reason, since it has these two combined elements, unfortunately, many in Ukraine were not willing to accept some of the common solutions that we as scholars of civil wars or scholars of conflict understand need to be offered, need to be negotiated, like the provision of autonomy to the region that wants to secede, the direct negotiations that you have to conduct with the leaders of these separatist republics. And Russia was insisting on these things, and sometimes it actually made things worse because those academics like me, analysts, or even politicians who were advocating for these things were immediately branded as sort of pro-Kremlin commentators who were spinning the Kremlin line. And so these ideas were immediately dismissed, primarily because these were things that were supported by the Kremlin. So when in 2019, President Zelensky comes to power and tries to, or promises to bring peace, and tries to relaunch these negotiations around Minsk agreements in the normative format, he quickly faces a very strong resistance from within the Ukrainian, within the Ukrainian society, especially the nationalist part of the society, the part of the society that is grouped around center-right nationalist parties or far-right political parties. And they came out on the streets, mobilized, threatened him with possible removal along the lines of Yanukovych. And he very quickly adopted the very same logic and strategy that his predecessor, Petro Poroshenko, had when he was stalling these Minsk agreements. As a result, after the first meeting with Putin in Normandy format in December of 2019, no new meetings were held. No serious agreements were signed. The promises that Zelensky gave were never fulfilled. And as a result, I think that chance for diplomacy that he had, and remember, Zelensky was elected with 73% of support by the population that was really sick and tired with the conflict in Eastern Ukraine and wanted to see the resolution. So if he were to mobilize this support, this popular mandate that he gained in 2019 very quickly, I think he could have pulled it off. And he could have made some unpopular decisions for some, or risky moves that would have still been acceptable because of his broad popular mandate. But unfortunately, he did not. And since then, the stalling of the Minsk agreements, as we learned from this week, became a pretext for Putin to withdraw from the Minsk agreements unilaterally, recognize the independence of these separatist republics, and then declare war on Ukraine.
Now, Rob English, you've described, and many others have as well. I mean, this was a frozen conflict in eastern Ukraine. It was something that didn't please either side, but it wasn't really it wasn't a shooting war, in at least in a traditional, in any sort of context here. And now we can see this attempt to try to resolve this, clearly had failed for a number of reasons that Serhiy just outlined. Why 2022? What's going on at this stage that would have compelled the Russians to indicate that this frozen conflict needs to be reignited? What's this pretext to change the frozenness of this conflict?
So you do want me to psychoanalyze Putin after all?
I didn't know if it was the psychoanalysis. That could be a political question, but if that's
in other words, why did Putin snap? Why did he take this decision? It still goes back to Putin's thinking, which we've now all agreed has something snapped. Something is very different from the coolly calculating, rational, even if aggressive, manipulative Putin of the past, and someone who's gambling his future, his legacy, and that of his entire country and all of his people. But having said that, I'll try to answer quickly, and then I want to respond to something or follow on something that Serhiy just said. I can only speculate. I mean, it could be that he had given up on diplomacy, had become so steeped in resentment, and had started taking more and more seriously scenarios for doing what exactly he's done now. After all, it takes a lot of planning. This wasn't planned in the last week. These plans were in the works for a long time. Whether they were just contingencies that he then made real, we don't know. But let's assume that, in fact, something within the last 6 months, let's just put it in that time frame. Again, I'm not saying that this justifies it. I'm just saying in Putin's worldview, with the kind of information he was getting and the kind of hyper-nationalist, revanchist, imperialist mindset that was growing, yeah, it may have triggered something when, number one, Zelensky, the Ukrainian government, renewed public calls to join NATO. That hadn't been the case a year before, but starting, I guess, about a year ago, I guess January, again, Serhiy can correct me, but again, it went right back on the agenda with the failure of reviving the Minsk talks and everything else that was associated with that. Zelensky began speaking publicly about joining NATO. Why aren't we in NATO? He directly challenged the new Biden presidency. He raised this again and again. This infuriated Putin. Maybe he was afraid it would now happen in the near term. The second was the continued upgrading of the Ukrainian armed forces. Again, not that there was a real threat, but in his paranoid or fevered imagination, the steady improvements of the Ukrainian armed forces, the acquisition of anti-tank weapons, the British helping build new port naval facilities, the maneuvers or training that were going on. It's possible that in his view, this all amounted to a creeping joining of NATO, just not in name, but in fact. And then a trigger might have been the Ukrainians' first use of some of their new weapons, namely drones, armed drones, I think purchased from Turkey. I think it was the infamous Bayraktar drones that the Armenians came to know so well. That actually had a successful strike on a Russian artillery position on the separatist side of the Donbass, the Donetsk divide. Take those all together, and it's possible that someone with this paranoid inclination could have seen something building up. And he could have actually believed, or at least been persuaded, that there was a significant chance that the Ukrainians were preparing, having given up on Minsk, having announced NATO ambitions again, demanding NATO. Zelensky demanded, and then with all the military preparations, he might have convinced himself that indeed another offensive was coming, another anti-terrorist operation. I'm not giving that credence, but those little pieces were there. That's an attempt to answer your question. It's highly speculative. I would like to answer back, though, your first question, at least the one to Serhiy, and keep going on that, because it's really interesting. The explanation is fascinating. It's incredibly important what he says. I wish there was more understanding of what went wrong with Minsk. Because the assumption, Doug, is that if Minsk had been, if the Donbass conflict, that might have, it's like you can look at Ukraine joining NATO issue and the resolution of the separatist Donbass region issue as separate. But of course, they're linked. This resolution of the latter could have obviated any problem with the former. When Russians, or at least let's say the Putin mindset, the sort of, the ruling political elite with this aggressive stance of Russia, listens to these issues. For example, why Minsk was not a fair agreement, because it was signed under duress and the bulk of the Ukrainian people never accepted it. Well, here's what a Russian would say. Welcome to my world. We agreed at the end of the Cold War under Gorbachev, under duress, desperate for economic aid for support to get out of Eastern Europe. And you told us you wouldn't expand NATO. And then you did, right? We signed an INF treaty back under Reagan and Gorbachev and dismantled all of our INF missiles. And you did the same. And then you invented something called the Sea-Launched Cruise Missile, and you ring our country with them. Every single American naval vessel and submarine, surface and submarine, carries these cruise missiles, and we face a triple threat from cruise missiles. They're just not launched from the ground. That was a complete change. Circumstances change, and the list goes on and on. The Conventional Forces in Europe Treaty, which Russia pulled out of, right? They signed that treaty when they had an alliance, when they had the Warsaw Pact. And then they were accused of violating it on these flank agreements because they moved troops into these troubled new regions towards the Caucasus, Central Asia, or Northern Europe because they lost their alliance. They were accused of violating a treaty, but from any sensible strategic point of view, you've got to feel sorry for the Russians because the circumstances, the military infrastructure and defenses they had once upon a time had vanished. And the list goes on and on. So this does not justify let me make it clear, what Putin has done and what he's doing. But I guess a Russian would say, if the Ukrainians have a right to renounce or fail to carry out an agreement, because number one, most of the people don't like it. And so that invalidates a legal international agreement? Or number two, because circumstances have changed and they don't need to now. We signed it, because we had to, but now we're stronger, so we're not going to carry through. Okay, I'm mocking that logic, but that's how it sounds to Russians. So again, Putin on that other extreme says, well, that justifies what I'm doing then. So he may not have enumerated all of these things in his latest speech, but he's certainly thinking them. They have been said and argued. Again, I want to make it clear, this does not justify. But if Minsk had a chance and its failure is a tragedy and is the off-ramp or the diplomatic solution that might have been what you asked Sergei, and I think is the most interesting question here, then it's complicated. It works both ways. And Russia's definitely wrong here. I know I'm saying this again and again to make sure I don't sound like an apologist, but this might be part of what's behind the Russian thinking and Putin's thinking. What's good for the goose is good for the gander.
And Anna Ohanyan, I'll ask you then that same question. Was there a diplomatic solution? Is there a diplomatic solution at this point? I think the former is probably an easier question than the latter now that the war has started. But is this a case study in the failure of diplomatic resolution, to an ongoing conflict that then becomes a shooting war?
I think Sergei and Rob so far did such a wonderful job in providing the two poles of this conflict, of this crisis. What could have been done on the Ukrainian side? What could have been done to manage Russia? So when you put the two answers together, you do get one type of an answer, the answer to which was, yes, there was a path. We'll talk about whether there is one. But I think Sergei's analysis of the diplomatic process, the domestic political constraints is spot on and so refreshing because particularly within the Western media, public discourse within the scholarly discourse, the narrative was being pushed that the agreements were, and we kind of knew, Sergei also said, and I agree with this, that whatever was there, autonomy, right, was the sequencing, whether the Russian troops pull out and then the reform, then the implementation, autonomy, etc. All of that would be done. That would give Russia leverage over Ukrainian politics, but it still would be a diplomatic path for Ukraine to manage Russia in the long term. Sergei was talking about, it was jarring to me as to how similar the challenges were in the Nagorno-Karabakh peace agreement implementation before the war. These are very different conflicts. Structurally, the role of Russia, absolutely. But I think in both cases, you had peace agreements where the public was not ready to implement and to agree on the compromises that were needed. So we probably as scholars really need to think as to how to communicate the social science on structuring peace agreements that work, implications, political implications for their implementations, and on, but also how to devise peace strategies, how to work with illiberal players, how to build peace processes while protecting human rights. So there is a lot, I think, that we need to learn. But I agree with this analysis. And Rob's point is also really critical that, yes, without justifying Russia, I think the West has created a moral hazard, both for Ukraine and for Georgia. I don't know if we're going to engage in hypotheticals and counterfactuals, what Russia would have done if Zelensky did not go around demanding NATO membership. But I think by NATO, Euro-Atlantic structures were so restrictive in terms of you get the benefits if you're in, but you're sitting duck when you're out, and constantly flagging it, with knowing full well there's not going to be security support for countries outside, particularly for, and then continuing to feed that narrative and linking that with democratization. I think that was just irresponsible. On very rare occasions, I'm agreeing with John Mersheimer, but actually he's not saying this. It's just simply saying that NATO expansion triggered Russia, which I think is too simplistic. It's part of the reasons. But what is even more troubling, and I've been writing about this specifically, is that democratization in general was tied to Western orientation. So there was the civilizational choice that was forced on these countries. If you're democratizing, you're probably with the civilized West, right? Well, does that mean Russia? If I'm in Russia, does that mean I'm uncivilized? Or does that mean that I have no path of democratizing if I'm living in Russia? Is Russia stuck forever to be authoritarian? That is why I think Armenia's democratization within Russia's security orbit as a model needs to be studied more in order to see how should Russia be managed in order to provide geopolitical stability for these states to start deepening civil societies, to start nourishing democratic breakthroughs from the bottom up, which are going to come sooner or later. Within the scholarship, I'm digressing a little, I apologize, but I'm not sure, I'm not fully convinced that the Kremlin is out to get democratizing states. In that speech, Putin was very scary as to how he denigrated democratic movements as populists, as these narrow nationalist elites who want power, so they mobilize the people. And this forthcoming book that you mentioned has a total different messaging on it. But at the same time, I don't think he's going out to get democratic states as states that are democratizing. I think as long as the countries do not do a geopolitical jump, there is a path for democratizing. He's not going to like it, but as long as if people remain sustained, mobilized, electoral politics is strengthening, Putin likes to take up until this war, the path of least resistance. Now, moving forward in diplomatic structures, there is always a path. There's always an alternative, I remain convinced. This might mean giving Putin something big, and he already proved in a battleground that he has the capacity, he has the appetite, the political will to go all the way, even though he does not have his political support in Russia. At the same time, though, I think he needs to have something big, face-saving. I don't know what his end game is, whether he wants to split Ukraine, whether he wants to eliminate the Ukraine's military infrastructure. I don't think he can install a puppet government and hope to manage it from afar, similar to South Ossetia, for example, or Abkhazia. This is a large country. It had democratic institutions, nascent but functioning. So I don't even think if he can even pull that off. So I don't know what his end game is, but knowing that the risks are so high for Putin as well, I do think there is a democratic breakthrough. I wonder, and this is pretty wild, but I wonder whether engaging Russia in managing Eurasian security, as opposed to kind of getting into this great power rivalry, whether engaging Russia through, for example, CSTO, NATO CSTO cooperation. We know the weaknesses of CSTO. It is Russia-led. It is people would dismiss it as a paper tiger. And I don't want to kind of add on to that criticism. It's there, but I wonder whether it'd be a way to socialist to kind of groom his ego that, yes, okay, be a responsible steward in your neighborhood, we'll play with you, but also socializing CSTO to emerge more or less a regional organization that can put some check over a Kremlin's unilateralism, not only domestically, as well as regionally. So yeah, it's something that I need to look into more. I have to study a little bit more, but I'm brainstorming with you simply to say that there has to be a new, fresh thing, new diplomatic pathway. NATO is a Cold War organization built for bipolarity, while the Eurasian continent is moving towards multipolarity. And there is a gap there, and Kremlin seems to be willing to fill it.
This is the Scholar Circle, scholarcircle.org. I'm Maria Armoudian. What could possibly end Russia's war on Ukraine? Will sanctions help? Will activism? Will Russia stop at anything short of Ukrainian defeat? Doug Becker explores.
I'm Doug Becker. The scholars we have on our panel today are Anna Ohanyan of Stonehill College, Robert English of the University of Southern California, and Serhiy Kudelia of Baylor University. A note on today's show: since events are ongoing, we recorded on February the 25th. Serhiy, I'll turn to you first. What options do some of the international actors have in responding to the Russian invasion, and what strategies or what tactics might have some more promise at trying to bolster Ukraine, or at least to signal that this is an invasion that can't stand?
Well, if you remember 2014, there was a dual strategy that the West adopted. On one hand, they were escalating the level of sanctions and the intensity of sanctions from week to week, from month to month. They were gradually introducing new types of sanctions. On the other hand, they were also offering Russia a diplomatic off-ramp where Russia could stop interfering in eastern Ukraine and would at some point agree to some kind of diplomatic settlement where the withdrawal of Russian troops from eastern Ukraine would be followed by some kind of guarantees that would satisfy Russia. What kinds of guarantees were never explicitly stated. We don't know what they talked about behind closed doors, but this was the dual strategy. And I certainly sympathize with what Anna just said, that Russia needs to be engaged, that the NATO alliance, in a way, is a product of the Cold War, maybe from view of some, and of course many European leaders talked about that, it outlived its usefulness. It needs to be changed with something different. Remember, especially the French president was highly critical and remains highly critical of NATO. But unfortunately, I think after what happened over the last 2 days, after this absolutely horrific, brutal type of assault that Russia engaged in against Ukraine, this absolutely unjustified aggression against Ukraine that is ongoing with lots of lives already lost, I do not think any type of meaningful engagement would be possible. In fact, what I think is that Putin needs to be further isolated, and it's not just Putin, but I think the sanctions that have to be adopted should target not just his inner circle, not just political elites, not just business elites whose assets were frozen, we know, a long time ago, but also Russian citizens, because ultimately it is the Russian citizens who bear the responsibility for the actions of their leadership. It's the Russian citizens who have lived under this president for the last 22 years. It's the Russian citizens who ultimately send their brothers, their sons to the war that is unjustified, in which tens of thousands of Russian citizens now engage, and something that many, many Russians unfortunately support. That is based on a lot of monitoring of Russian media. We see that there is explicit support from most of the political forces in Russia. Only one party, Yabloko, spoke explicitly against the war. Out of any major party, only Yabloko was participating or calling on the Russians to protest. All other political parties, unfortunately, all major parties, endorse this conflict. And so without imposing costs on the Russian citizens for this, and by costs, I mean banning their visas, I mean refusing to have any business bank accounts for the Russian businesses, to terminate any joint business ventures with medium-sized Russian businesses, disinvesting from Russian companies, ultimately kicking out Russian students from the universities, refusing Russian scholars to work on issues specifically in the areas that are important for national security. All of that, I think, needs to be done in order to communicate to the Russian society that it's not just elite that will be paying the price ultimately, but any member of the Russian society, and that Putin's actions are in a way threatening the future of every Russian citizen. For that reason, I think any type of engagement that Anna described, any type of serious discussion of how NATO can be changed, can only happen after the war ends, the Russian troops are withdrawn. And most likely that is going to happen, unfortunately, only when there is a serious change in who is running Russia at this point in time.
Now, Rob, I know that there's been some news coverage of protests in Russia. I mean, Serhiy has pointed out that this may not be reflected in, political parties or, political elites challenging this. But is there political peril on the part of Vladimir Putin that the combination of certainly economic pain, perhaps political pain that are attached with sanctions, coupled with the fact that, we know there's an anti-war movement in Russia. Could this fracture Russian society, and maybe that ultimately might compel a re-examination on the part of the Russian leadership?
This is also complicated. It has so many practical as well as ethical dimensions. I'm not sure what I think, but I'm very uneasy about the arguments that Serhiy just made. And I think the final summation he had was something along the lines of to make sure the Russian people, justifying these kinds of harsh sanctions that would hit students and ordinary people and so forth, to make the Russian people understand that they have to stop supporting them, something like that. I don't know. There's an enormous risk of backfire there. That right now we are seeing civil society, and this is just the beginning, right? It could be in a week we see 10 times the amount of protest and mobilization. And it could be that the announcement of harsh sanctions that are going to hit all of Russia, that aren't going to target the oligarchs and the elite, but are going to expressly target ordinary people because we think it's up to them eventually, could actually undermine a nascent civil society anti-war movement and turn a lot of people to say, well, I was thinking of joining that protest, but goddamn, those Americans, they're blaming it on me. Again, Serhiy said they send their sons to fight. No, they don't. Their sons are drafted. You can look at the number of political parties, but that's assuming the political system's democratic and the parties that dominate and get seats in parliament somehow reflect the will of the people. And I don't think it does. I would look at the history of previous sanctions regimes that essentially use the same logic, right? We know we're going to hurt ordinary people, but we just have to do it. And maybe then they'll rise up and throw off their leader. Is abysmal. It far more often tends to unite people who were already fractured from their leadership or, moving away from. And that's when sanctions don't explicitly target. If you're going to do what Serhiy says, I certainly don't. I hope you wouldn't describe it that way, that the responsibility is on you. You have to stop supporting this government. You have to stop sending your sons to fight illegal wars. because the first response is, I'm not supporting this government. I'm not sending people to fight. And yet you're singling me out. The risk of backfire, again, historically, I would think that's more likely. Not that we don't want that to happen. We absolutely do. But if we're already seeing shoots of that happening now, I don't know, maybe immediately going after the people, if I'm probably overstating what Sergei meant, might not be practically the best thing to do. I'd like to go crazy here for a minute and just get out of the conventional scenarios of sanctions, more sanctions. Who do we sanction? Sanctions, they work so badly anyway. They're not going to save Ukraine in the next 3 weeks, right? These are things that work, maybe if they do, over years. Here's something that might work very fast and not even be something we can be planning. I'm waiting for the moment when we hear about a brigade of Russians that just lay down their weapons and mutiny because of some confrontation where they are forced, they're asked to shoot some prisoners. They're looking their Ukrainian brothers in the eye and they say, I'm not doing this. Or when a Russian prisoner of war, right? A Russian is taken prisoner by the Ukrainians, interrogated, the guy breaks down and says, I didn't want to do this. None of us wanted to do this. We feel terrible. Forgive me. And he says it sincerely, right? Because he means it, because many do think that, because they are being drafted in force. Not everyone there is like a killer contract mercenary, although plenty are. And when that soldier I just described, some articulate Sasha, goes on Ukrainian, or records a video, goes on Ukrainian TV and says, my fellow Russian soldiers, my brothers, Russian brothers and sisters, what we've been thrown into is horrible. You're not being told the truth. We are killing innocent Ukrainian civilians. We were told they're going to welcome us. We were told it's a bunch of neo-fascists and drug addicts. It's not. This is a free country. This is a country that has nothing against us Russians, and we are destroying it. This is wrong. I renounce my soldiers' duty, whatever. I denounce my government, and I ask you to do the same. Imagine a video like that, right? Not at the point of a gun like Al-Qaeda, but done sincerely, honestly, in the Russian language, how it would ricochet around the world, go viral. I might be a naive optimist, but I'm looking for things like that, cracks in not just the Russian society at home, but in the Russian mission, the forces over there. When we see defections, when we see, contrition, when we see surrender, and the Ukrainians handle it with grace and dignity and turn it triply to their advantage. Let me just close with one comment. I'm sure all of us have thought of it. I'm not sure how you say it in Polish, za naszą I waszą swobodę, right? The slogan of the Polish freedom fighters, Poles who fought against Russian, Austrian, German domination when Poland was partitioned, Poles who fought in the American Revolution, right? They fought for our freedom, for your freedom and ours, right? Poles who fought in the American Revolution, Poles who fought for the Hungarians in 1849-50, and then the Tsar sent in Russian troops to prop up the Austrian autocrat. And finally, in August of 1968, when Russia, the Soviet Union, the Warsaw Pact, led by the Soviet Union, mostly Russian force, invaded and crushed the Prague Spring liberal movement in Czechoslovakia. And a couple of days later, a brave group of 8 dissidents went out on Red Square and unfurled banners in a silent but silently loud protest. And they said, hands off, ruki proch, off Czechoslovakia, and down with, Leonid or Ilyich's adventure. That would be Brezhnev. But most moving of all, za naszą I za waszą swobodę, right? For your freedom and ours. I hope we're seeing some of this, all that I'm laying out happening now, and that economic forces, they still matter. Military forces matter. Coercion matters of all types. But by God, I hope that something spiritual and ethical comes careening in unexpected from the side and becomes a determining factor. I know everyone's rolling their eyes. Rob's always the optimist, but there will be some wild cards like that in the weeks to come. And I really hope some of my optimism for once is justified.
Though I suspect there's a bit of naive optimism in all of this, I think I'd like to end on that note, on an optimistic note, that I think it's essential that, first of all, that we look to the Russian response itself, definitely pressure coming from the government from within Russia. And if we craft it in that way on how perhaps to most inspire a Russian response to demand a withdrawal. And of course, coupled with what one of my expectations is, if Russian troops remain within Ukraine, they're going to face asymmetric tactics and will probably continue to take casualties. That certainly has been the mark in post-Cold War conflicts. And I think that could certainly, have an impact. So I'd like to end perhaps optimistically, even though it might be hoping beyond reason at this point, but I want to remain hopeful. I want to thank you all for joining us on today's extremely important show. We've been discussing Russia's invasion of Ukraine and the conflict that began today, as well as the diplomatic steps that seem to lead to this conflict. Our panel has been Anna Ohanyan, the Richard B. Finnegan Distinguished Professor of Political Science and International Relations at Stonehill College. She's the editor of Russia Abroad, Driving Regional Factors in Post-Communist Eurasia and Beyond, and her latest book is The Neighborhood Effect: The Imperial Roots of Regional Fracture in Post-Communist Eurasia. Robert English is Associate Professor of International Relations and the co-director of the Central European Studies program at the University of Southern California. He's the author of Russia and the Idea of the West. And Serhiy Kudelia, Associate Professor of Political Science at Baylor University. He is the author of When Numbers Are Not Enough: The Strategic Use of Violence in Ukraine's 2014 Revolution. And a reminder, I've also published a piece on this topic, The Rationality and Emotion of Russian Historical Memory, The Case of Crimea. You can find that in Crisis and Change in Post-Cold War Global Politics, Ukraine in a Comparative Perspective. Thank you all very much for your insights.
And that's it for today's program. Thank you for listening. The Scholar Circle is hosted by Doug Becker. Its managing producers are Ankina Agassian and Melissa Chifrin. Sed Dongre is our webmaster and assistant producer. Our archives are at scholarcircle.org, and our podcasts are on Apple and Google Podcasts and iTunes. Please follow us on @ScholarCircle or me @Armoudian and join our Facebook page. I'm the founder, anchor, and occasional host, Maria Armoudian.